guys, and welcome back. Today we're working on a watercolor and gouache painting, and as usual I do have a link to all the tools down in the description, as well as a link to my art shop where you can get this original as well as prints. And yeah, let's go ahead and jump right into it. So this one I kind of unintentionally ended up doing a self-portrait. I used obviously myself as reference for the drawing, and it ended up looking a lot more similar like myself than I necessarily was meaning to. And that's okay. It was kind of fun actually to do a piece that was a self-portrait. I've done a couple in school, and there's just something about being able to like express yourself in a very straightforward way. You're drawing yourself. That's pretty fun. I have also really enjoyed, there's a lot of artists that'll do a new self-portrait of themselves every single year, or just a regular occurrence, so that they can see how their style is reflective in that and how they're growing and how they perceive themselves. So it actually is something that I would probably like to do more of, particularly in paying attention to how I'm developing style-wise, because that is a big thing moving forward that I want to get better at, and that's doing more realistic faces with better blending and shading. And I think that drawing myself would be a good subject matter for marking my progression in my ability to paint that better. So yeah, it did end up being a little bit closer to me on accident. But yeah, I recommend that if you're thinking about it, or if you're just really stuck on a subject to draw yourself. You're a great model. I mean, you're already there. You have mirrors or cameras. You can take reference of yourself and be able to just jump right into it. I particularly like taking reference of myself because I can get very distinct lighting situations that I want, or very specific poses. And I know that I'm a huge advocate. I talk about it all the time for using references, but using references of yourself that you're posing for is incredibly helpful for getting that exact thing that you wanted. But I like, and usually when I take reference like that, I will usually take it and then find pictures of other faces and other features that I can start infusing into the drawing that I'm creating. That way everything doesn't end up looking like me, but actually most poses are myself, and most face poses as well. I usually take several of myself. So that's usually how I do make sure that it doesn't look too much like me. But today I didn't actually do that step, and we ended up doing this. But yeah, I do recommend it. It was fun, and it was a good experience. And at the very beginning, you probably saw where I had a little color comp of this painting. And I do those for pretty much all of my paintings. Usually I do multiple ones, but this one I ended up spending a lot more time on it for one this size than I normally do. I think I spent over an hour painting this one because I wanted to get a very clear game plan on how I was going to render the face. Because I feel like that's the next big thing that I need to start tackling, is figuring out how to render faces with better lighting. Lighting is the thing that I really think that I haven't learned yet about watercolor. I've really not put in the time to study it. Like, I know that I'm not comfortable and good at it because I haven't taken the time to just figure out how to do it. And I do want to get better at that. I want to be able to preserve the lights so that it's still has that quality within the watercolor. I don't want to always have to go in and add the white back in with gouache, and I want it to be able to be something that can be well blended. So I spent a lot more time on that, figuring out exactly what my game plan was to be able to render that out. And while I was working on that, I was looking at lots of references of faces and how light was cast on it so that I could get an idea of how to do that. But when it came time to actually painting the final one, there's always things that going from my color comp into the final just throws me for a loop a little bit. And the biggest thing I think is that I'm much more timid when it comes to painting the final. I no longer have the freedom of knowing that it was just a little one-off one, or if it doesn't work, it's easy to start over. And I can see that it really does affect the actual final outcome. For the background, for instance, I'm trying to get better at using broader, more aggressive strokes, because when it's very small, it takes a much smaller brush and a very small stroke to suddenly be a very significant element in that color palette. But when it comes to actually a final one that's much, much larger, I have to be way more committed to it to be able to get that same effect. And I haven't quite allowed myself to get to that point yet. So I'm trying to be more aware of not just how I'm going to render it, but the motions behind it and the brushwork that goes into it. The brushwork is really something that I do struggle with as well. But I think I got a little bit better at the background. I think that overall the energy in my color comp for the background was a little bit better, but I'm satisfied and happy with this one. But when it came to the face, I was very timid. I was scared to mess it up, and because of that, it did end up not as good as it could have been, I think. There were areas where I put something down and then I got a little bit nervous, so I dabbed it off more, whereas when I was doing a color palette or little color comp, I just let it be what it was, and I built it up a lot more, and I wasn't afraid of putting something that was too much color or too dark yet. And I did spend way more time layering it, so it wasn't that I was just going in too dark too fast. It was more that it was time to put in the darks. But when I was painting the final, I was having a little bit of a gun-shy moment where I didn't want to mess it up, and in so doing, it turned into a self-fulfilling prophecy where I did actually kind of mess it up. So a little recap. Things that I need to get better at transitioning from color comps is I need to get better at having brush work that has the same kind of energy, and I also need to not let myself get hung up and afraid to put down the layer and the color and the value that it needs to be. I need to let it be more saturated when it's time to be more saturated. And I actually ended up using way more gouache in this painting than I normally do, which is something that I'm really excited about. I have tried using gouache to do the entirety of a painting before, and I did not like how thick and counterintuitive it felt for me. It just really felt like I was struggling with it, especially with faces. So I know that watercolor is always going to be the cornerstone for pieces like this, but I've been wanting to get more into incorporating gouache so that I can be a lot more adaptive as I'm working on things, because with watercolor there is a limit to how much you can edit and fix something, and then with gouache, since it's opaque, there's a lot more play that I can have. In this piece in particular, it came into play a lot more. There were a few areas that I do wish that I had held off and been a lot more clear on what exactly was going to happen and what it was going to look like, particularly the clothing. Looking at it at this point where it's white and unfinished, I actually really love that. I love having elements that are just a little bit unfinished. Unfinished as in unpainted. But I always move past that and I end up painting on them anyways. But I wish that for this painting I might have considered letting the clothing be a little bit more paper white and unfinished. But I did end up trying to do a few things and messing it up, and then trying to cover it with gouache, and then not liking that, and then ultimately covering it all up with a very dark gouache. And all in all, I think that either the white or a dark color, like what it ends up being, is the preferable option as far as contrast and the look that I wanted. But I wish that I could have had a clearer end goal. That way I could have done it right off the bat with probably watercolor, so it didn't look as overworked. Basically, that's the thing that I need to start working on, is just getting better at utilizing both gouache and watercolor in my pieces. And I'm pretty comfortable with watercolor, but I'm still learning with gouache. So there are a lot of steps in this painting in particular, where I was like, yeah, I don't think I used gouache as well as I could have. But that just comes down from practice and understanding. And I'm excited to figure that out. But overall, I did feel a lot happier working on this piece, knowing that it was something that I had a lot more control over. There were areas that I did fix, and I was really happy that I was able to bring it out of an area that I didn't like into something that I did. Yeah, this is basically the part where I was really going back and forth and struggling with the clothing. Ultimately, I did decide to go with the dark because I was like, well, it's a self-portrait and almost entirely all the clothes that I wear are black, so I might as well go with something that's representative of me. But it was also an option that I tested out when I was doing the color palette, and I liked it, but I decided to not do black because I didn't want it to be too much of the same value as the background. But ultimately, when I was looking at this, I decided that I wanted more contrast between the hair and the skin and the lighter elements of this piece by darkening the clothing in contrast to it. And the line work that I did for this piece ended up being a couple of options. I started off with ink because it is waterproof and it wasn't going to budge when I go over it. But then I started transitioning into using gouache to create that. And I think that's my biggest hang up with using gouache for line work, is that I can no longer be as aggressive with covering it with watercolor or even other gouache, because it does lift up and it can color even the gouache that I'm covering it with. Or when I'm doing watercolor, it's pretty much out of the question because it totally just blends it right in, and then I have weird opaque watercolor. And that is my biggest struggle, because I do want to be able to incorporate these elements of line work while I'm painting a piece, because that contrast is really important to be able to see it while I'm working on it rather than at the very end, because it can really change how I want to approach a piece, how I want to change it and edit it. So I do have a hard time working in a process that reserves any sort of line work till the very end. I want that to be a thing that I work on throughout it. So I'm not sure exactly how I feel yet about using gouache for the line work yet. I'm not sure. I have also considered doing watercolor for the line work. Again, watercolor is something that when I use washes on top of it, it can erode depending on the pigment, but it can also be something that if I'm more aware of what paint I'm using, there are some that are staining, like my turquoise. My turquoise is very, very staining, and it pretty much won't budge at all once it's down. There's paints like that that I could use for line work, and I think that it would work really well. So I'm still kind of balancing where I want to go with my line work and how I want to incorporate it into these pieces so that it is something that I can have it cleaner but more control and have all the elements that I want. So I haven't quite got the hang of the future of my line work yet, but I'm excited about it, and that's what's fun, is that it is an experiment that I'm playing with. And one more small, quick little tip. If you're doing stars like I did in the background, the best way that I've found to do it is to take the back of your paintbrush and dip it in what I used as gouache, but if you're using ink, that works fine too. But I just made sure that it was a pretty thin consistency. I dipped the back of the brush in, and then I dotted it down. So the first dot would be the thickest, and then each subsequent one would be smaller and smaller. That way I utilized what point I was at so that I could get different sized little dots all over. But that will get you perfect circles, and it actually is surprising how much of a difference looking at lopsided stars can be. There were several that I painted with a brush, and I wanted them to be perfect circles, so I went back in with this technique on top of it, and it actually does make a pretty good difference. And that's it for today. I would love to see any self-portraits that you guys have done, or if you'd like to do one along with me, just tag me. My name is Danica.Sills. On Instagram is mostly where I post things. So if you tag me, I would love to see it. I think it's incredibly fun to see what you guys are doing, especially when we can work on a similar prompt together. So yeah, please tag me so I can see it. I would love to. But as usual, I do have the original available, so if you'd like to own this painting, I have a link in the description as well as in the end card, and I also have prints of her available as well. I just want to say thank you so much for everyone who does make a purchase over at my shop. That is a huge help for me to be able to keep putting out these videos. So every single order, I can't express how much gratitude I have for you guys. But yeah, that's my little pitch for you guys. But that is it for today. I do every Wednesdays and Saturdays, so if you'd like to see my other videos, go ahead and hit subscribe and that little bell notification so you can continue seeing more of my stuff. But that's it for today, so I'll see you guys at my next one. Thanks for watching.